Welcome to another edition of Under the Radar. I am your host Atul Aneja. On November 29th, a very unusual conference took place, and it was hosted by none other than the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval. Mr. Doval had invited his counterpart from Indonesia, Mr. Mohammed Mehfud. Along with Mr. Mehfud came a delegation of Ulemas. Now this starcast seems to be a little different from what usually happens in conferences. The purpose of this conference was very different. The reason being that neither was it theological nor it was overtly political, but there was a deep security implications behind this initiative taken by National Security Advisor Ajit Doval. The purpose of this conference was essentially very deeply security. This was really an out-of-the-box conference. Now the reason why you get Ulemas into it, it is really the thinking behind is that we need to counter terrorism and the ideology of terrorism. How do we do it? By creating a counter ideology of what is followed by organizations, let's say like the Islamic State or the Al-Qaeda. Now it was important to get the Indonesians on board this initiative. So the conference really was meant to ideate on a syncretic ideology, which would be a counter to the extremism of a Wahhabi ideology or an ideology pursued by the Islamic State or by the Al-Qaeda. Now, it was a very deliberate decision to bring Indonesia on board on this initiative. Mr. Doval, in his opening remarks, himself made it very clear the purpose of this exercise. He pointed out that India and Indonesia have very large Muslim populations. In fact, Indonesia has the highest Muslim population in the world, and India has a third largest Muslim population in the world. So together, they can shift the balance of influence on an ideological plane against the ideology of extremism. Now, Mr. Doval in the conference also mentioned a very important point, that the reason why Indonesia and India need to bond is because of the historical ideological pursuits, in the sense that both India and Indonesia have a very strong ingrained syncretic culture, and there is a seamless fusion of Hinduism and Islam in both countries. There is a spirit of communal harmony and a camaraderie in both the countries, because just as India has a very large Muslim minority, Indonesia has a very large Hindu minority. But both countries over the centuries have managed to create an ideology which is peaceful and which is harmonious, and which has in the end resulted in generating prosperity for the people of both countries. Mr. Doval mentioned very clearly in his opening remarks that what has happened between India and Indonesia is a unique experience of interaction for centuries. In fact, he mentioned that the people-to-people contact between traders, between religious figures, and generally people at large went on seamlessly till the 16th century. And that is the legacy on which we need to build a new modern foundation of the digital age. In fact, the subtext is very important here, that even after independence, there was a special relationship between India and Indonesia. Prime Minister Nehru and President Sukarno of Indonesia were one of the founding members or the advocates of the non-aligned movement. In fact, the Bandung Conference of the non-aligned countries bringing Asia and Africa together took place in Indonesia. So there is even a recent sort of a layer which unites India and Indonesia, but somehow because of historical reasons, because of what happened after the death of Sukarno, the coming in of Suharto, his close ties with the CIA and the US, that disrupted the seamless flow of interaction between India and Indonesia, but that needed to be recovered now. And that is why the conference which took place is setting the ideological plane again for a grand new revival of the relationship between India and Indonesia. In fact, the conference which took place opens the door for a much larger relationship between India and Indonesia, including on the security plane, because there is a larger strategic importance of Indonesia, which India realizes, and which feeds into the current geopolitical landscape, the competition between India and China in the Pacific and especially in the Indian Ocean. Now, why is Indonesia so important in this exercise of having a situation where China does not overwhelm India or the countries around in the Indian Ocean? And that is because Indonesia has a very unique maritime position. It has a number of choke points in case if you see the shipping and trade flows which go from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, they have to pass through Indonesia. And there are several straits in Indonesia which are of prime importance to trade between India and the Pacific. And in case any of them gets blocked, it can be a catastrophic blow for harmonious trade and economic interaction between countries in the Indian Ocean, India as a pivot in between, and Indonesia and the rest of ASEAN and beyond. Now, what are these straits which are of very strong and prime importance to India, which need to be safeguarded against a possible Chinese intrusion, a possible attempt to block any of them and disrupt India and hit it on a geoeconomic plane? Now, the most important among them is the Strait of Malacca. Strait of Malacca is something which links the Indian Ocean with the Pacific, essentially the Andaman Sea and the South China Sea. It passes through Malaysia on one end and Indonesia on the other. And then it enters the South China Sea, and from where it goes northwards or southwards as it is. In fact, most of the containers and energy tankers will pass through and feed trade in Southeast Asia from the Strait of Malacca. It is one of the major gateways of international trade. The other very important strait is the Sunda Strait. Now, Sunda Strait is between Sea of Java and the Indian Ocean. The Sunda Strait is the junction between Sumatra and Java, and it links the Sea of Java or the Java Sea with the Indian Ocean. Now, historically, it was very important strait because a lot of the trade from the Dutch East India Company, that was something apart from the British East India Company, which carried its trade into the Spice Islands through the Strait of Sunda. But there's a problem with the Strait of Sunda that it is very turbulent and quite shallow, so larger tankers are unable to pass through it. Nevertheless, it remains an important choke point between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Another very important strait is the Strait of Lombok. Now, the Strait of Lombok is another channel between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. Essentially, it passes through the island of Bali and the island of Lombok. Now, unlike Sunda Strait, it has got very deep waters. So many thinkers on the maritime plane believe that it can be an alternative to the Malacca Strait, because then that will give a entry. It has got very deep waters and therefore can be seen as a strait for the future trade between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. Indonesia also hosts the Umbai-Vitar Strait. Now, this is a strait of great strategic importance. It is very deep and it has been traditionally used by US nuclear submarines, including submarines which are called SSBNs, ones with ballistic missiles, to pass through this strait from their bases, let's say in Guam, and as they move northwards from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Indonesia is hosting this plethora of choke points, and from an Indian perspective, it is very important that none of these choke points get blocked, because India's trade in the Indo-Pacific will invariably pass through the Andaman Sea, the Andaman Nicobar Islands, especially the 10-degree channel and the 6-degree channel, and then funnel through Malacca and through the other straits for trade with the ASEAN. And therefore, Indonesia becomes very important as a strategic anchor for India's Act East policy. It is therefore not at all surprising that Mr. Doval in his address made the significant point that a strategic partnership between India and Indonesia is central for peace, regional cooperation, and the prosperity of Asia. And it is with this vision that a new beginning has started between India and Indonesia.